So Richard Furman, the founder of Furman University, the proponent of the convention model that ended up developing in South Carolina as a whole, the prominent early Baptist advocate who lives into the early decades of the 1800s and was so influential even today. His political theology is our focus here, as he took the baton, so to speak, from Oliver Hart and continued advocating for religious liberty in the minor tradition, the South Carolina tradition. Furman's political theology, according to Yarnell, had three major aspects. First, he considered all human events to be the outworking of divine providence. Second, the divine approval of human authority, he argued, is granted only through a constitution that was based on human consent. So no dictatorial authority is legitimate there. Third, God has providentially ordained the structures of society, and it is a human duty to live within those structures. So Richard Furman, who follows Oliver Hart at the First Baptist Church of Charleston, he also gives us a really interesting example of how religious liberty can be complexified because he's advocating for measures in state and even national government that some today, if you're especially Virginia tradition influenced, or you have a strong view of the separation of church and state that's foreign to Baptists, but you think it's Baptist, Richard Furman is going to ruffle some feathers just a little bit. My aim is to show that the South Carolina tradition represents religious liberty as a matter which could coexist strongly with a church-influenced state. In other words, while the state cannot establish a church per se, the church should influence the state. Thus, the South Carolina tradition presents religious liberty within a Christian frame, Christian presuppositions, Christian underpinnings and laws, and we could go on. How does Richard Furman defend or explain his view that all of history, his first point, is under divine providence? How does that help us think about religious liberty? Well, in a sermon commemorating the life of George Washington, Furman argued that the armies of the Revolution succeeded, quote, under divine auspices, or the patronage of heaven. Indeed, genuine and enlarged liberty, both civil and religious, brought about by the Revolution and constitutionally established, are due to God's moral government. We won the Revolutionary War because God was in it and God gave us the victory, in other words. As a result, Furman's willing to call the new nation that emerged our American Israel. And he described it as a sacred duty to defend the rights and privileges which accompany now constitutional liberty. Furman asserted that God speaks to man in afflicting dispensations and exercises special interposition in favor of the just and the innocent. And this is because God is the great arbiter who judges the causes of men, and he believed that they had come out victorious in the Revolution because God was on their side. So, how does Furman speak about God's approval of appropriate human authority? Well, this is our second point. In 1775, Richard Richardson published Furman's pamphlet in which Furman had defended the American Continental Congress in opposing the unlawful authority of the king and parliament because they had no representation. Quote, if a person does not object to another man's exercise of unlawful authority, hey, I see that. That's wrong. You shouldn't be doing that. If you don't object, Furman says, I then submit to his unlimited power over me, and by my own consent, he has a right to lay upon me what he pleases. Inaction itself results, therefore, in granting the king authority. Furman believed that the king himself was subject to the Constitution in the way he read Romans 13, thinking about the British political system. The British Constitution allowed for a mixed rule wherein the king and the people made laws through a representative situation, Parliament, and the representative laws were then binding on the people. If the king sought to make or act upon laws which ignored colonial representation, then the British would have, quote, broken the principles of the Constitution by taking away the power of our assemblies. So you see he's doing a pretty rich and thick assessment of how the right and responsibility of the government as an institution of God can coexist with the call for Christian citizens, for citizens generally, to submit to the government. What does that look like? Well, he says there's rightful authority and there are unrighteous authorities which we don't have to submit to. In order to preserve the Constitution, he argued, the American colonies must then oppose London's Parliament. That's what they did, and he's defending it after the fact. Opposing London's Parliament should not be viewed as a rejection of the king's lawful authority, but of Parliament's unlawful authority. Whatever the king does contrary to the Constitution is not, in Furman's view, from God. He doesn't have to submit to it if it's contrary to the Constitution. The king is only authorized to do that which God authorizes him to do, and God has only authorized him to do that which, in this system of government coming from England, has come about through the legislation that involves representation in Parliament. So if the laws have come about through a representative Parliament that don't include the United States, it's an unjust, illegitimate authority, and the United States does not have to submit to it. Think about this as a justification and defense for the revolution here. Where the king ignored the people and asserted authority that was not in their best interest, and ignored the laws of the land which had been conceived through a proper methodology, he would argue divinely conceived through the representative system of England, the king should be opposed. Because the king's authority is for bringing peace and happiness to the people, and because the British government includes a representative legislation, divinely granted authority flows to the king through the people. And any unlawful exercise of that authority, any authority that does not recognize that system, is illegitimate. Very clearly, what the king does, Furman says, contrary to the Constitution, is not the power that is of God, spoken of in Scripture, and therefore ought not to be obeyed. Supporting the British in their continued rule over the United States would be to conspire against the liberty of conscience and would extinguish that precious jewel of the Constitution. Notice the principle here in the way Furman frames constitutionality based upon popular consent. Authority in government levels arising from the grassroots, from the bottom up, not from the top down. Legitimate authority emerges from God through the people. Now, Furman was eventually elected to represent Charleston at the Constitutional Convention of South Carolina in 1790. Because in 1778, Oliver Hart, that constitution he had influence over, that constitution had explicitly denied civil offices to clergy members, many objected to the appearance of Richard Furman and several other clergymen as congressional office holders in 1790. In the end, Furman's opponents prevailed, and ministers were indeed barred from holding state office. The revised constitution that developed then in 1790 in South Carolina continued to grant the free exercise of religion of churches, but dropped any language of establishment. Furthermore, South Carolina granted liberty of conscience in its constitution, yet the liberty was, quote, not to be so construed as to excuse acts of licentiousness. Religious liberty has always had limits, right? Acts of licentiousness, or to justify practices inconsistent with the peace or safety of this state. Besides holding office, Furman sought to utilize state resources for Christian purposes. Think about this. There's so much complexity to this today, to Title IX and Title IV in education institutions, to how churches receive government funding for various kinds of mercy ministries. A lot of complexity here. But at the time, it was not as complex, given what the government stood for and that the government was so influenced by Christian principles. Furman would use state resources for Christian purposes, and he argued that Christians should influence the civil government. During the 1800 presidential race, Thomas Jefferson ran as a Republican candidate for religious liberty. We've talked about the Danbury Baptists there. While John Adams ran with Charles Pinckney from South Carolina as the Federalist platform of religious orthodoxy. In this setting, notice the irony here of the Virginia tradition and the South Carolina tradition. The Virginia Baptists, especially the Danbury Association with John Leland, found themselves on politically opposite sides of the Charleston Baptists in that election regarding Thomas Jefferson and Charles Pinckney. This is due to Furman and Charles Pinckney's long-standing relationship and Furman's public support for Pinckney and John Adams. What else did Furman do? He preached before two different civil societies after the death of Alexander Hamilton due to a duel to encourage them to legislate to abolish the practice of dueling. In 1814, after resigning from the South Carolina Convention, Furman conversed with James Monroe, the then president, and then preached before the president, foreign ambassadors, and numerous other dignitaries from Acts 22:16 that they should arise and be baptized through faith in Jesus Christ. In 1822, he addressed the governor of South Carolina on behalf of the South Carolina Baptist Convention and urged the government of South Carolina to institute a day of humiliation, prayer, and thanksgiving. Well, the third aspect of Furman's political theology regards the social order and personal duty. Furman argued that the best means of securing a nation is, quote, a strict attention to religion. It has to undergird it. He did not mean an establishment of religion in the state, but personal attention to religion by the state's citizens. Furman was ambivalent, as it turned out, about the institution of slavery. He really reflects the general pattern of evangelicals in the first half of the 19th century, the 1800s there, where until 1800, many had criticized slavery who were evangelical. Between 1800 and 1820, many evangelicals cooperated with the institution of slavery. And then between 1820 and 1845, many evangelicals began to defend slavery as even a positive good because of, for example, providentially the way slaves could hear the gospel through their masters. It's very twisted logic. Furman went from saying that slavery is undoubtedly an evil, that's a quote, to later affirming the common statement that slaves are spiritual equals but social subordinates. A couple of lessons I think we can take here from recognizing these traditions on religious liberty. If we let the outcome of a situation, if we let what God has providentially ordained to come to pass be the rule of our conduct for what is right to do, we will baptize inhumane practices. That's a lesser point in this total lecture and what we're considering here, but it certainly is important to recognize. For example, if slavery were ever used for good purposes, such as the salvation of the slaves through hearing the Gospels from their masters, and if that dynamic, a slave became a Christian through the institution of slavery, if that dynamic is used to justify the institution of slavery, then God's ability to work good out of evil is being used as an excuse to justify inhumane practices. We can't let the way we view God's providence in the world dictate to us the rule of our conduct. God's commands and putting together all that God says in His Word dictates the rule of our conduct. It's a side point, but I need to mention it. Second, and this is regarding the broader theme and examples we've considered with the major tradition and minor tradition here, it must be said that Baptists have advocated for religious liberty and a religiously influenced government with some consistency throughout our history. On the premise that the government must act in accordance with God's divine law, or we might call it natural law, or we might call it general revelation principles or truths, on that presupposition, Baptists have understood that a government that is divorced from God's moral order will be a government in which religious liberty cannot function. When a government is built upon and advocates for the indoctrination of secular principles that are unmoored from the existence of God and from the revelation of the Scripture. When the government is advocating for principles untethered even from those truths which can be observed in the creation order, well, then the state is going to become unworkable for everyone. In other words, religious liberty can only exist when the conditions of the government are sufficiently influenced by Christian moral presuppositions and natural law. This is why the United States today, in our country, so much work is being done in academic circles and pulpits and in the pews to reassess the methods and lengths and past successes and failures of cultural engagement. May we as Baptists champion religious liberty, but may we see that it can coexist, and indeed it must coexist, with certain foundational principles that are influencing the government to make that religious liberty even feasible.